see us, we can't see you. The whole thing is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube on the IEA channel. But feel free to ask questions. I'll be asking questions of our 4 guests who I'll introduce in a moment. And for the last half hour or so, we'll go to questions from our viewers. You can also use the chat function in which you can chat amongst yourselves or to the panelists. So the issue is the hospitality sector. That includes pubs, bars, it includes hotels, nightclubs, casinos, snooker clubs. This is my actual snooker club, I should say. It's a very big part of my life until the government took it away not so long ago. But a huge range of venues for us to socialize in. The hospitality sector employs 3.2 million people, but is a source of great pleasure to many more than that. I'm ready to talk about this. I've got my pint. You can see this thanks to this technical trickery, but I've got a proper tankard there. I've got my pint, got my tabs, and I'm ready to kick off with our wonderful panel, who are in alphabetical order. Dehenna Davison, she is the Conservative MP for Bishop Auckland, its first Conservative MP ever. She won with a majority of nearly 8,000 back last December. Prior to getting involved in politics, which wasn't so very long ago, she's one of the youngest MPs. She worked in the video game industry, the casino industry, the betting shop industry, and the fast food industry. Very sound indeed. She's also against HS2 and wants to scrap it. So absolutely fantastic guest here for the IEA. Perfect, you might say. We hope to have later on Tim Martin, the chairman of JD Wetherspoons, joining us. I think that's the source of some of our technical problems, but he's been on IEA TV before. Hope to see him shortly. We've got Dan Mobley, who is the corporate relations director for Diageo, the big drinks company, FTSE 100 company. He previously worked at Standard Chartered in London, Africa, and India. And before he entered the private sector, he spent a decade as a civil servant, mainly in the UK Treasury, but also in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in Brussels. And last but not least, have Kate Nichols, who is the CEO of UK Hospitality, which, as the name suggests, is a trade body representing Britain's entire hospitality sector. She worked as a researcher in the House of Commons and European Parliament before joining Whitbread as government relations manager, starting her career in hospitality in 1993. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. Kate, perhaps I could start with you. I mean, some people watching may be thinking, well, you know, the furlough scheme has been extended. It's back up to 80%. The government is continuing to dish out cash grants. The idea is to put the economy into hibernation, and once this is all over, we can all come out again. So what's really the problem? Tell us what the problem is.
Well, I think, you know, the hospitality sector never really came out of lockdown. We were allowed to reopen in July, but we reopened with very stringent restrictions. So you've had a very protracted period where these businesses have been on effective life support and at best have had 2 months of relatively normal-ish trading at the start of the year, which is our weakest performing part of the year. And then in the middle, July and August, we were allowed to reopen, but at best people were earning 60 to 70% of their normal revenue levels, so well below profitability. Just to put it in context, in 2019, the end of 2019, the sector, as you say, employed 3.2 million people. It had a total revenue of 139 billion. 39 billion of that was foreign export earnings from tourists coming over to eat and drink out in our pubs and bars. We had a forecast growth rate of 5% this year, and we were going to generate 1 in 6 of net new jobs. At the end of Q3, so before we went into this lockdown, we had already lost 20% of our workforce. So we're down to 2.5 million people at the moment, but just over 1 million of those are still on furlough. So those jobs are very vulnerable to being made redundant unless we can get the businesses through it. And furlough is brilliant at supporting individuals and employees, but if you don't keep the business underneath it on life support and get them through this restricted period, those jobs simply won't exist. And going from a 5% predicted growth rate, annualized growth rate, to a minus 50% annualized growth rate over the course of this year, likely to get worse as a result of lockdown. So you've got an industry in a very precarious state. That shows the scale of the opportunity. If we can get through this, if we can get to sort of January to April, we will start flying again, and we will be the generator of jobs and growth and regeneration across the economy. But you've got businesses that are very low in cash reserves, very low in resilience. We've got 76% of them saying that they won't survive into next year while they are in tier 2 because they are unviable, and 94% of them are unviable at tier 3. So if we continue with these restrictions, we are going to decimate an industry which is vital to our economic recovery, vital to levelling up and the reskilling, and vital to regeneration of our high streets and communities.
And Dehenna, one of your colleagues, Andy Carter, was recently barred from every pub in Warrington because of his support of lockdown, which is a big problem if you're the MP for Warrington, as he is. Are you concerned he might get the same treatment in Bishop Auckland, or are you getting on better with the publicans there?
Well, thankfully, I've not been barred from any yet that I know of, so I'll take that as a small victory at this stage. But I have been almost as outspoken as I possibly can be in Parliament on hospitality. So I was going back through Hansard's day to figure out how many questions I asked in the kind of real heat of lockdown about hospitality. And across the course of 2 weeks, I think I've made 7 contributions in the chamber, specifically about hospitality, asking about how we could do more to support, publicans in my constituency right across the country. And just making sure that hospitality as a sector is really taken seriously as we move through this pandemic. Because, for many of the reasons that Kate outlined just now, hospitality has been one of the hardest hit sectors. We know that. And that means, an awful large number of people who've been hit by this. Now, the government's put in place some incredible schemes. The furlough scheme has been a godsend for so many. I've lost count now of how many local businesses, including hospitality businesses, I've helped access their business grants, and many, many other schemes. And for someone who tends to be a bit of a low tax, low spend Tory, it's strange to hear me saying it's great the government's spending so much money, but it's absolutely the right thing to do to protect this sector, because as we know, it's not just a sector, it's not just words, it's about people in real lives. And hospitality, particularly, pubs, one of those sectors that really is at everyone's heart. So I think about some of my earliest memories, and maybe it says a lot about me and my family, but a lot of my earliest memories are going up to one of our local village pubs, sitting in the family room there with my mum, with my nan, the whole extended family. And I remember it so vividly. We've had wedding receptions in pubs in my family, we've had funerals there, and I know my family are kind of not alone in that. They really are at the heart of every family and of every community. And so it's kind of incumbent on all of us to do whatever we can to support this sector. I think the Eat Out to Help Part scheme was a really positive scheme that certainly helped out those venues that serve food. And I know I saw absolutely packed venues in Bishop Auckland, obviously within COVID secure measures, but certainly not able to take any more bookings because every single table was full. But we really need to make sure we get this right moving forward, because what we don't want to see are restaurants and pubs closed, never to return. Because as I said, they're at the very heart of our communities, and once they're gone, it is so hard to get them back. So kind of our job as politicians is to keep pushing, keep making sure the government's getting things as right as possible. I made myself slightly unpopular by rebelling against the government on the 10 o'clock curfew, which, I've had a lot of stick over from my own party, but for me, it felt like the absolute right thing to do for this sector. And I will kind of continue to stand up for hospitality as much as I can in Parliament.
Thanks, Dan. Diageo doesn't own any pubs, as I understand, unlike some of your competitors. So to put it bluntly, why are you that bothered? I mean, you're selling most of your booze through the off-trade and supermarkets. And yeah, I understand you're spending quite a lot of money to try and help keep the pubs going. So what's your concern, just purely from your kind of narrow interest, and what are you doing about it?
Thanks, Chris, and good to be with you again. A huge amount of our sales still go through pubs and restaurants and bars. So, of course, although we do well in the retail sector too, pubs are absolutely vital. They're the heartblood of our business. And it's often where consumers first come into contact with our brands, where they first see and enjoy Guinness or Johnny Walker and everything else that we sell. And they're also just a critical part of the social fabric of this country. And I'm sure Tim will talk to that too. Dehenna's talked about it too as well. And they're just an essential motor of the economy. And, the UK is Diageo's second biggest market after North America. We need a healthy UK economy, and we cannot have economic recovery without a thriving hospitality sector. And I think it's really important just to pause, because I mean, Kate talked about the staggering impact of the sector. And I think one of the problems with COVID is we've become all a little bit numb to the scale of what's happening and numb to some of the figures that are being thrown around. But you've just heard Kate there talking about 1 million people whose jobs are at high risk of disappearing, huge numbers of businesses and livelihoods that we know under current conditions are not coming back. And lockdowns are uniquely difficult and savage for hospitality, more so than any other sector, because of the problem of spoilage. If you close a pub or a bar or a restaurant, a lot of your stock goes off. Some of your food goes off, but your beer goes off, and you need to replace it. And so what we saw in the first lockdown is some of the pubs never recovered. They couldn't afford to restock and reopen. And what we're seeing in this lockdown is we're hearing that story repeated again. And with all the rumours flying around that we might be in a position until a vaccine is rolled out, whenever that is, probably spring, summer or later, this idea of turning hospitality on and off like a light switch just does not work, because they cannot survive that repeated opening and shutting. You're not like a hardware store where it's difficult enough, but at least when you pull your shutters back up at the end of lockdown, your stock's still there. You have nothing, and yet you've got to pay all these bills and have to restock. So it's uniquely difficult. But even without the lockdown, as Kate's just said, so many of these businesses are going bust. 90% in tier 3, 70% in tier 2. So this isn't sustainable. Even if we were to go back to where we were just before this lockdown, for many of these businesses, this is not economically or socially sustainable. And just beyond the human cost, the other reason why we should care about this, and we're going to publish some new research tomorrow that Oxford Economics have produced, is the furlough cost. The million workers that are on furlough just in hospitality, the taxpayer is spending £1 billion a month. So when I talk about numbing statistics, £1 billion a month to keep these people economically inactive. Now, Kate said the furlough scheme is welcome, and of course it is. That wage support is desperately important. But we now need to think about another model. These businesses need to be allowed to trade through the winter months, because if they don't, the cost in human misery, the cost of the economy, the cost of the taxpayer is unsustainable.
And Kate, I could just ask you about the other parts of the sector. I don't want to get focused entirely on pubs, as important as they are. But I mean, you represent the restaurant industry, the casinos, I guess, do you? Certainly the nightclubs.
Some, yes,
nightclubs. If you take something like nightclubs, I mean, obviously we all accept that this is not just, the government victimizing the hospitality industry. There is a virus on the loose, and a lot of people wouldn't be going out regardless of whether in tier 1, 2 or 3. Something like nightclubs, do we just have to accept really that they are not going to be around for at least the next 6 months? It is kind of like Cineworld, really.
I think you are accepting that they're in hibernation. I think same with the events industry, conferences, etc. Those venues are standing empty. They're standing unused. Those parts of the economy are sort of the forgotten ones. Nightclubs and events. Nobody's given them special grants. They are totally left to their own devices to remain closed. I think hopefully rapid and mass testing will allow us to reopen parts of the economy that have been closed for longer, that are causing that are challenging to reopen. Obviously a vaccine helps. We need to support these businesses though, because they are viable business. The only reason that they're not viable at the moment is that somebody has told them they can't trade. They're closed by legislation. And I do think if you have closed down an entire sector, an entire business by legislation, it's incumbent upon the government really to provide that support mechanism to keep them going, get them through this, because these businesses will be viable. As soon as restrictions are lifted, we know that demand will return, and we know that they can rapidly become economically productive again. So we don't want to lose all of these businesses and these buildings and these community hubs, because Dehenna spoke very eloquently about the importance of pubs. Equally, there's for a lot of people, music venues, nightclubs, they are really vital. They are the grassroots venues where people hone their craft. The Smiths started out in pubs. You've got super DJs across the world who will have started out in their local nightclub. These are important parts of our community, important parts of our cultural and social heritage that we ought to be protecting and supporting. Yes, they can't trade at the moment, but given some help and support, they will be able to get through this and be able to come back.
So let's get down to looking at some solutions here then. I mean, we all understand there's been a serious problem, and it's not going to go away entirely, obviously, for quite a long time. I mean, assuming that the lockdown does indeed end on December the 2nd, which Boris Johnson promised that it would, and now it seems possibly might go on, maybe with a few days off for Christmas for a while. But let's assume that it does end on December the 2nd. There's no doubt that they're going to go back to some kind of tiered system, possibly as they have in Scotland. You both mentioned, I think all three of you perhaps have mentioned tier 2. Just to remind the viewers, this was where pubs were still open, but you could only go to them with a member of your own household, which rather defeated the purpose of it as far as I was concerned. And we also had the so-called curfew, the 10 o'clock closing time. Dehenna, what was your reading of the evidence for those kind of measures? Do you think they were justified? I mean, we had someone from Sage saying that the tiers system didn't work, but was that because actually some of these ideas like the 10 p.m. curfew did more harm than good?
It's something that, you know, as MPs, we've all had to kind of weigh up really carefully. And I must admit, I have been really grateful to the Department for Health for giving us those briefings and the opportunities to actually ask questions of the scientific advisors, kind of, well, I'd say face-to-face over Zoom anyway, which has been really useful and did uncover kind of some of that information. For me, the 10 o'clock curfew, I really didn't feel was justified by the science, hence why I did kind of in the end vote against it, which was a big decision, my first and only government rebellion. So it shows how seriously I kind of take this matter and how much I do care about hospitality. And I spoke in a lot of depth with one of the health ministers about specifically why you were only able to meet with a member of your own household or a bubble in a pub. And I said, what's the difference? Because if I'm going around a shop, you know, I could talk to a friend in the shop if I bump into them or something. What is it about pubs? And one of the things was literally just the fact that they're kind of indoor venues, and there is still this kind of some evidence to suggest that indoors the virus spreads more rapidly, that if you are sitting with someone for longer than 15 minutes, there's more chance of it spreading to them, where obviously if you're in a pub with your mates, that is going to be the case. But one of the other things that was raised was about volume in pubs as well, because the louder you're having to speak to be heard, the further the kind of air particles from your breath are going, and so the more chance there is of this virus spreading. But as far as I was concerned, I mean, you know, obviously the last thing we want to see are people dying from coronavirus. 100%, we must think about public health. But I think, to be honest, the tiered system, I think, was the right approach, looking at a localized approach so that those areas with kind of the hottest spots of COVID were kind of tackled first. But I think we need to be really, really mindful of this moving forward to make sure that we are hitting those kind of real transmission hotspots and doing as much as we can to make sure that the pubs that are being really careful to put in those COVID secure measures are able to open as usual.
I mean, Dan, the argument against, I guess, is I think I've seen people who work in all sorts of different industries all saying, well, there isn't any evidence that there's ever been a COVID case happen because of us. You know, people in nail salons going, well, there's no evidence actually nail salons are a significant transmitter of the disease. And of course, we haven't really pinned down any specific transmitter of the disease. We know most of it happens in the home, but of course, people aren't initially catching it in the home, they're catching it somewhere else. Some people would say it's just obvious. You've got loads of people who are getting increasingly inebriated over a course of an evening, all together. Yeah, they're spaced out, but they're still all together. Isn't it obvious that this is a major vector of disease?
Well, I think there's actually quite robust evidence and a growing body of evidence around different parts of society and the economy and what's contributing to transmission. And all of that evidence points to hospitality venues being a very, very small part of transition. And that's from the government's own figures. So we know from Public Health England that less than 2% of outbreaks are being traced back to hospitality venues. That's been consistent since they reopened in the summer and remains true until they were locked down a couple of weeks ago. We have the new ONS figures today saying about 1.6% traced back to hospitality, tiny numbers compared to other areas of society. And the big difference is actually when you look at pubs and restaurants and bars, they have had to put in much more stringent COVID secure measures than any other part of our economy. We have 100% and perfect contact tracing because you have to reserve. You cannot get into a bar and a restaurant unless you give your contact details, unless you give your name and allow people to trace you. And that's one of the reasons actually that contact tracing is showing such low levels of transmission. You have to have all the sanitizer, all the PPE, the sitting down that's enforced. And let's not forget, pubs, restaurants have invested huge sums in getting this right, in line not just with the government guidance, but going beyond the government guidance to make sure that they've implemented social distancing. We've supported that. Diageo's committed £30 million to provide pubs and bars across the country with PPE, with sanitizer, with outdoor solutions like mobile bars to allow them to create some more space. So I think that the evidence is pretty strong, actually, that hospitality is not a driver of the problem. And Dehenna mentioned curfew, and thank you for voting against that. I mean, not only is that doing nothing to stop viral transmission, it's so clearly, obviously counterproductive. Why on earth would you force large numbers of people out onto the street, into public transport at exactly the same time? It makes absolutely no sense. It's also encouraging people to go and gather in private homes. And we know that this is happening. It's this kind of crazy idea that I'm afraid some politicians labor under, that they can perfect humanity if they tell them what to do. You know, humans are social animals and will find ways to socialize. So put them in COVID secure spaces where we know they're at lower risk. Don't force them into illegal parties. Don't force them into homes where a lot of the transmission, huge amount of the transmission, is happening. That is wildly counterproductive. So we need to scrap the curfew and scrap it as soon as possible.
Okay, hopefully we got Tim. Tim, can you hear us?
Very faintly. I've had tremendous. I think I went through the US nuclear code to get on here, but can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very well.
I think I was on my phone to get through. I was on my phone on a loudspeaker, and I think it still is. And I don't know how to go off this and turn it off loudspeaker. So I think that's what's messing it about. But I can hear you faintly.
Okay, I'll speak up. We spoke, you and I, only a few weeks ago, shortly before the lockdown, when it didn't seem actually the lockdown was very imminent, and you were saying how disastrous things were. I know you've now closed most of your pubs in Scotland. How are you seeing things now?
Well, it's just the strangest state of affairs, really, because the thing that I most don't understand is that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and the death rate for the UK seems to be a normal year. So if the words pandemic mean anything, you would have expected more people to die, but that actually hasn't happened. And so we're in a sort of strange world where the entire economy is in terrible trouble, and I think it's in much worse trouble than people realize. And living in a half world where very poor decisions are being made by the government, but they're actually supported by the opposition parties. I mean, they're arguing over minutiae, but everyone is pro lockdown. It's just the degree of lockdown that you have. And it seems to me absolutely clear, which I'm sure people have been saying on this call already, that lockdowns don't actually work. And the rules are being changed all the time, but you now have an impossible jumble of different tiers, and again, I'm sure that's been said, and different national jurisdictions also changing the rules. So you've got the amazing mess now of different tiers in the UK, and then entirely different tiers in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. So the UK used to pride itself on being a place where it was easy to do business, but now it's incredibly complex. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And the oddest thing is that it's being done under, as Jonathan Sumption has pointed out, that rules are being made under emergency powers. So the Parliament itself doesn't have much say or much debate, and let alone UK hospitality, let alone Wetherspoon or anyone else being able to make much impact. So things worked quite well in July. It seemed sensible enough, a sort of Swedish type set of rules, which Kate and others put together. Difficult, but we could have adapted to that. But what's happened is every few weeks they've been changed on some sort of capricious basis. So rather a nightmare. And how we'll only get out of it if the political masters understand that they're going to kill the economy. But at the moment they haven't. They've got this magic money tree, and the markets are giving them money to do these incredibly expensive experiments. So what's going to happen, I think, is the only way we're going to get out of this, unfortunately, is by a very severe economic crisis. That's normally what happens when people don't know what they're doing economically. Eventually, they run out of money. 1970s Britain is on its way back.
Good.
Callahan
And
his inheritors have taken over.
It's normally my job to be the most pessimistic one on these IEA videos. We're trying to be a little bit more optimistic and look for a way forward. I mean, Kate, what's the solution here? What should the government be doing? Are there innovations? You know, given where we are, where Sage is at, where the politicians are at, clearly you can't just go back to normal overnight. You mentioned something about rapid tests, for example. I mean, what kind of technology can we use to make sure that the government understands that these venues are safe, because they are?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do need to keep ramming home the message that Dan's just made about how safe we are. 60 million customer visits a week to hospitality, just to put it in the context of 2% of infections outbreaks that are linked to us. 60 million customer visits a week, less than 0.5% of our workforce have tested positive for COVID. If we were somehow spreading COVID, our workforce would be unable to work. They're not. They are still there. They are tested regularly. So we know that we're not spreading it, and we know that we are safe. So we need to just remind people of what we already do to keep them safe. What we put in place, as Tim very kindly said, we did work hard. We had the best and the most robust COVID secure protocols in the world for our hospitality venues when we reopened in July. Social distancing, sanitation, hygiene, ventilation. Then there are technological solutions. For an awful lot of our venues, nightclubs, bars, those kind of venues, they have higher ventilation standards and air conditioning standards that bring in fresh air on a frequent basis. That will help to dissipate the disease. Public Health England has looked at that. There are other technological issues that are being looked at in terms of spray archers, which spray and give you COVID secure surfaces, so you can make sure that the bacteria just dies in the air and on the surfaces. And then finally, I think the rapid and mass testing. You know, we've been involved in some of the trials that have been going through in Liverpool, and Liverpool Hospitality has been involved in that. This is testing people on an almost daily basis. It's not testing them to see whether they've got the disease. It's testing to prove a negative. So that means that those rapid tests that give you a result in 15 minutes can be a real enabler, not just in reopening venues that it's challenging to reopen, because then you can say, well, have you had your negative test? Yes, you can come in to the wedding. You can have more than 30, to the conference, to the music venue, to the nightclub. But also it means that people can be more economically productive, because if they are exposed to somebody who's had COVID, they could rapidly test. No self-isolating for 2 weeks for the Prime Minister if we were to have rapid mass testing that allowed you to test on a daily basis that you weren't COVID positive. So those kind of initiatives, that would help to reopen our economy. It would help us to learn to live with this disease, because I think it was Dan who said, you know, it might have been Tim, lockdowns don't work. All they do is buy you time. If you keep buying time and then don't use that time properly to put in place the measures to stop you going into lockdown again, you've just wasted it and you've killed the economy for nothing. Let's use this time to get rapid mass testing up and running, to get a truly effective test and trace. Then we can reopen international travel and tourism. Then we can open events, music venues, all of those billion-pound industries that our economy needs. And we can get on with living our lives with this disease and keeping people who need protecting, keep them safe, so that we don't reopen the economy at the expense of public health. It shouldn't be a binary choice. We have to have both.
Dehenna, this sounds rather like Operation Moonshot. Do you think this is a way forward? How expensive? What's the cost of this? Is this going to be partially paid by the private sector? We're looking at rapid tests when you go into a restaurant, or is this another huge government project?
Well, thankfully, Chris, I'm not in Treasury, so I don't have the answers, and I won't pretend to know them when it comes to the cost.
100 billion, I heard.
But the point is, I mean, rapid testing definitely is the answer moving forward. We've got these 15-minute tests now, which are absolutely remarkable. They tell you instantly whether you've got it, and I believe whether you're kind of able to transmit it as well. It's kind of pre-symptomatic. They're fantastic, incredible technology, and I just think we should definitely pay tribute to the scientists who've been working non-stop to come up with these incredible tests, but also with vaccines that now feel like they are right around the corner. I think provided that some of these vaccines are successful and are approved, we'll start to see those rolled out before Christmas for the clinically vulnerable. That's absolutely fantastic. And then obviously then on to the NHS and other kind of essential key workers there, which is absolutely the right approach. But I think, you know, certainly if there was a way for the hospitality sector to get hold of those tests, I mean, frankly, if you're standing in a queue waiting to get in somewhere, you know, you can have a test, 15 minutes later you get your result, and you can either be allowed in or otherwise based on how you've tested. It really is going to unlock so much for us. The key now is capacity, making sure we've got enough of those tests available and, you know, targeted towards the right people. But Kate, I think you're exactly right in what you said. This doesn't have to be a binary choice. You're right, between public health and protecting the economy. There are ways for us to move forward and make sure that we're able to kind of straddle that and do both. And I think it's really important that we do that.
Dan, I think I
Can
saw
I
you
interrupt there for a second, Chris? To say, what I'm worried about is that we're chasing pie in the sky technological solutions. And what I don't understand is we've only had one case in all our 850 pubs where there was transmission within the pub, and that was or proven transmission within the pub, and that was for a number of staff who were messing around at back of house in a pub in North Wales, and it triggered the test and trace actions. And they decided they looked at this and they said, shall we contact the people in the town of roughly 100,000 people who've been to the pub? So they had the 1,500 names, and the local authority and the health authorities decided not to, because what is the point? They established that there was social distancing within the pub. They looked at the video, said, yeah, the social distancing within the pub, and a very little chance of it being transmitted between people in the pub. So what's the point of phoning up 1,500 people who've been to the pub in the last week and saying that some of the staff have tested positive for COVID, especially since, and this is obviously a decision taken by the health authorities, especially since you know that the danger to people who go to pubs, because they're on average way under 70, is almost, or the danger of death is almost negligible. If you're under 70, as I've understood the medics, it's half the danger of flu, approximately. Very dangerous if you're old or you have comorbidities, but then you tend not to be in a pub. So I'm wondering how the new really techno system would work in those circumstances. What would you do in this particular town? Who would you test? And the other thing is, and this is a point that was made by Matt Ridley in a recent article, in which is sort of an exaggerated version of what I've just said. In America, there were 70,000 students who tested positive for COVID. 3 were hospitalized. Most of them were asymptomatic. 3 were hospitalized, and they all recovered. So if you have a situation like that, it's a plus, isn't it, to have 70,000 students who've tested positive, as the Barrington Declaration doctors have said, because you're building up herd immunity and protecting older people, which is the name of the game. So I think the idea in the UK, you're going to get some whizzo technical system, whizzo system to test for something that's relatively mild, isn't going to work. I mean, I'll probably get massively criticized for saying that, but I just don't think it's going to work. It's out there now. That's what Anders Tegnell and Johan Giesecke say. It's out there. The disease is out there. And for most people, it's mild. Protect those who are older, and have a vaccination program, a herd immunity program together for the rest. But the idea you're going to go to Liverpool and test everyone in Liverpool for this virus is just pie in the sky. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, the trouble is that's obviously not the government's view. So we're just going to be in lockdown permanently, unless we find some other solution to this. Dan, I think I saw you nodding away when I mentioned private sector providing the tests. Do you want to just come back on anything Tim said? And also, I wanted to ask you, because I want to go to the audience questions. We haven't forgotten about you, audience. Please do keep adding your questions and upvote them so I know which ones to ask. But the one thing I wanted to ask you before we did that is, you work globally, obviously. What lessons are there, if any, from other countries and how to kind of deal with this?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we operate in 180 countries, and I would say different regions of the world are dealing with this issue in very, very different ways. And I do think it's important to look at what different countries are doing and potentially learn from that. But just to go back to kind of solutions, first of all, because I agree with you, the government's not going to shift at the moment until the economic and social pain becomes so great and so unsustainable. By then, it's too late. And we, as we say, we seem to be sleepwalking into a world where we're accepting that more than half of our hospitality businesses, more than half of them, could be gone by February. Yeah, and that's not sustainable. So we have to find a different way. And I think there are different ways we can do. So we've already talked about just scrap the curfew. And by the way, there's rumours coming out, no doubt we'll hear on Sunday in the newspapers, all sorts of rumours about what may or may not be allowed. But there's a rumour that, for instance, you might not have the curfew in tier 1, but you would have it in tier 2 and 3. I mean, this is nonsense, yeah? If it doesn't work, it doesn't work whatever tier you're in. So just get rid of it, because that hour or more for businesses is crucial. It allows restaurants to have that second sitting, and it's a massively important hour for pubs. Many pubs take more than a fifth of their takings between 10 and 11 p.m. So give them that back, and it gives them a fighting chance. The second solution, and we're going to call on the government to do this when we publish this new research tomorrow, reopen outdoor spaces straight away. It is crazy that when you have people seated outside, socially distanced, with contact tracing, the risk of transmission of virus is practically nil. We know that. The evidence is overwhelming. Give the pubs and the restaurants their outdoor spaces back. And you ask for lessons from other countries. Catalonia have just announced within Spain that's what they're doing, reopening all the outdoor spaces immediately. New York has gone this way. They haven't allowed indoor dining or indoor bars to reopen at the moment, but they are saying outdoors, and they're doing everything they can to help businesses create that outdoor space, including heaters. You may have seen the plastic bubbles that they're creating around tables. A lot of innovation going on, and consumers are coming back. We need that mindset here. And the third point I would say is, I hear Tim on kind of don't wait for technology to save you, but I think there is a role for technological innovation here. I think mass testing is interesting and is something we need to look at, and could be a way of unlocking some businesses over the winter. But I'd also look at ventilation. Dehenna mentioned this concern around aerosolization, that if you're in an enclosed, poorly ventilated space talking at length, that might lead to transmission. Now, we know the rates are very low, as Tim and Kate have said, in hospitality venues. But if you're genuinely worried about that, the government should turn around now and say, this is the standard we want for ventilation. And it's easy to test. Let's be creative. You can test whether pubs and restaurants are ventilated. Put a carbon dioxide monitor in them. You can see whether the air is clean or not. And if it's not, then don't allow that venue to function. And it can be as simple for smaller venues. Throw the doors and the windows open and turn the heating up. It might be expensive, but it will create the ventilation you need, and that space is safe. There are things you can do in terms of mobile ventilation units. They're only £2,000 each. The German government is putting them in schools today, because it recognises you can't have the windows open all day in schools. The kids are freezing. So they're starting to scrub the air, and it works. So I would call upon the government urgently, and I hope parliamentarians will call for this too. Don't approach this just with the mindset of how do we shut everything and pray for a vaccine. You need to approach from the mindset of how can we do this in the lowest possible risk way. And let's get our experts and the experts in the industry together and look at these solutions so that we can give these businesses a fighting chance over the winter. We cannot wait for spring. It'll be too late for all of them.
Okay, let's go to that questions from the audience. I want to go to one from Gerald, and I'm going to kind of just add something to this question because I think it's an interesting one. He says, when we come through to the other side of COVID, I imagine demand will return to pre-COVID levels. Does the panel think that surviving businesses will be able to fill the void left by bankrupt businesses. To which I would add, sort of as a cold-hearted economist, I mean, even if lots of these pubs and restaurants go bust, the physical premises still exist. Somebody can come in and buy them. Presumably, as Gerard says, there'll still be the same amount of demand, roughly speaking, for nightclubs and bars and restaurants. So from the consumer's point of view, although it's very sad for the individual licensee who's lost their business, the businesses will still be there, won't they, more or less? Anybody who wants to answer that, it's just raise your hand or what have you, or speak up. Okay.
I'll go first. It is very hard to recreate them. Once you've lost them, they are lost for good, as we found with so many of our pubs that we've lost. You know, when I started in the industry, we had 66,000 pubs, and people used to say to me, we're over pubbed, we could do with reducing the number of them because then we'd have more demand going around. We're now at 49,000, and we've just lost 25,000 outlets, pubs and restaurants particularly, over the course of this pandemic. When they go, they don't come back very easily. They are bought up by developers. They are often turned into other economic functions. So they might return to life as housing. They might return to life as shops. They seldom return to life as pubs and restaurants. And even if they do, even if you're talking about high streets and town centres where we are going to lose a slug of properties because of high rents and high rent debts, the fit out costs are so significant that these venues will not come back to life very quickly. So yes, long term, you may find that people will take them over. That's if they don't get turned into another property use, but it will take time. And businesses that have lost all of their cash reserves and have no resilience and are very heavily indebted, you know, we are going to come out of this pandemic with what were good, robust businesses who are going to be so indebted that they won't be able to focus on growth and expansion. So I think we need to be very cautious about something like that suggests that over time, the consumer will be better off. The consumer will be worse off, and other businesses on the high street will also suffer, because we know that people spend more time, more money in shops when they've got complementary hospitality businesses around. People spend more time and are more likely to go to a cultural venue, a theatre, to go into their town centre when there's good quality hospitality as well. So it has that knock-on effect across the country. And, you know, yes, it's a cold-hearted economic way of looking at it. The warm-hearted, cuddly social scientist would say, what an experiment with people's lives and livelihoods and mental health and well-being. These are people's jobs that are going. These are millions and millions of jobs in every constituency, every village, every town, every city across the UK that will take generations to get back.
Chris, the process you described of the resurrection of restaurants, etc., the economic process happens through a very severe recession and a regeneration over a number of years. So what I think would happen is you would immediately go, we're already in a recession, but it would be very severe, and the process of the regeneration might take, unemployment might go to £5 or £6 million. Gradually people would start doing new businesses, and you get back to the situation you were in 2019, several years down the line. It's the damage in the interim, I think, that's the issue.
Got another question from Christopher, who says, making venues COVID secure may satisfy the bureaucrats, but are the panelists aware of how off-putting these restrictions are to the customers? I know, Danny, you said that people are flocking to these bubbles in New York. I think they look absolutely ridiculous myself, but anybody want to have a go at that question?
It's bloody awful for the customers. I mean, some of them will accept it because they've got to get out of the house, but it makes it a much less attractive venue. Particularly, a lot of people like to go to a pub to stand up, but they have to sit down because apparently COVID bug only transfers if you're standing up. Plus the bureaucracy, waiting in queues, etc., etc. It makes pubs and restaurants less attractive. So the chap who wrote in there had a good point. It's another handicap for the hospitality industry.
I think Christopher asked a really good question there, and I kind of to a large extent agree with Tim on this. You know, there is kind of nothing more soulless than walking into a pub and seeing all these little glass screens that make you feel like you're inside a goldfish bowl, where you can't really hear what it is that the bartender's saying because they're behind a screen as well. That's if it isn't table service, where you're then waiting way longer than usual to get your drinks. And I must admit, Tim, I'm a huge fan of the Wetherspoons app and always have been. But I also like being able to go up to the bar and order a drink if I want one. So I really want us to get back to those days as soon as we bloody can.
Well said.
I would add, I mean, obviously this isn't great for customers. Nobody likes this, but it's much worse for many customers that they lose the social hub that is going to pubs and restaurants. And we know that that has a really serious effect on people's mental health. And we know the vibrant part that pubs and restaurants can play in local communities that far outstrips just going for a drink. And so I think that loss is worth a temporary period of having these dreadful social distancing measures in place if it just gives these businesses a chance. The other thing I would add, what we've learned is I hope the criticality of these hospitality businesses to the economy and to our communities, but I have been disturbed by quite how easily some commentators and some sections of society have kind of binned hospitality because they've been given a false choice. You know, if you ask someone, are you prepared to lock down the hospitality sector because otherwise people you love will die? Of course, we're all going to answer yes to that. And it's led to this really, you know, we had this bizarre debate before the 4th of July reopening that was pubs versus schools, as if there was a trade-off there. There was never a trade-off between pubs versus schools. It was just a totally fake dichotomy that was created, and it did enormous damage to these businesses. And it also scared customers away as well, who we've now got to gradually bring back into the trade when it's allowed to operate. So I'd say it's a price worth paying to save these businesses and give them a chance over the winter if the government will only let them.
Okay, I got two questions there. I think I can merge them together. One is from Martin, great friend of the IEA. He says, nanny statists always say how vital it is to restrict products they dislike, but defense of leisure and recreational goods is dismissed as trivial. The state has more important things to worry about. Does this imbalance mean that the huge economic and cultural benefit of the hospitality industry is not taken as seriously by politicians as they should be? Alternatively, an anonymous attendee says a little bit more bluntly, could it be that politicians actively want to destroy the British pub trade and COVID is just another opportunity for them to stick the boot in? Dehenna.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Not from my perspective, not from the perspective of any of my colleagues. If nothing else, you know what politicians are like for having a reputation for spending too much time in the pub. So we need them. We need them ourselves just as much as society does. But no, you know, something that I've been very keen to do is raise hospitality frequently with Treasury, with ministers at BEIS, with ministers at MHCLG, right across the board, just to make sure that there are voices in Parliament, really just reminding ministers how crucial a sector it is. And I certainly wasn't the only voice in there doing that. So hopefully that's a little bit of reassurance. It is being taken seriously. That's why the government's put in place measures like the VAT cut for the hospitality and leisure sectors, a very specific targeted cut there to specifically try and help out this sector. So hopefully that's a bit reassuring. Apologies for the strength of my initial answer, but no, from this politician, we certainly love our pubs and don't want to see them go anywhere.
If that's the mentality of government, then I wonder why they've closed golf courses. Because if you had an attitude of promoting sensible businesses with zero risk, why would you close all golf courses in the UK? So something's going wrong between between common sense and action. So I'd love to meet the person who've made the decision to close golf courses. So of course it's a very small part of the economy, but it's surely economic vandalism to close them down. I mean, it would be almost impossible to catch COVID from while you were out playing golf unless you suddenly got in a relationship with your caddy. I'm not even a golfer myself, but there's something insane at the very heart of government that they've been closed down, and without sort of any conscience. Just we'll have to close this. It's the most perplexing thing when you get that sort of illogical behavior. You have to worry about the economic understanding of those in power, I'm afraid to say.
We'll have a webinar about the future of the golf industry next Thursday. Tim, I've got a question here. I suspect it might be planted by one of your employees. It says, is now the time to scrap VAT in pubs and restaurants?
Well, Wetherspoon alone, and this is an interesting stat, pays 1,000th of all UK taxes. So you only need 1,000 businesses like Wetherspoon, and no one else at all would have to pay any other taxes. It's a weird stat, and a hell of a lot of it comes from our customers, employees, and the company itself. A lot of it comes from VAT. And of course, the government does need income. Everyone knows that. But I think what's been wrong in the last 30 or 40 years, and it's progressively got worse, is there isn't tax equality between supermarkets or pubs. And to drive people out of pubs by creating a wide differential in the price of a pint between pubs and supermarkets doesn't make economic sense. And I think the Chancellor has understood that. He's actually gone a long way towards tax equality, but albeit it's due to end in a few months' time. So we're not going to be able to scrap VAT because it's an important part of the government's income. And we don't want to have to get rid of the army or close down all the hospitals, so we have to pay it. But what would be really sensible, and it's outside the COVID argument, is to have equality. Taxes should be fair and equitable, and at the moment they're not, and it creates a distortion, closes down pubs, makes it more difficult, makes them more expensive.
Can I just add something on that, Chris? Because I think, whether you scrap VAT or whatever, the sensible thing to do would not be to make us put our prices up by 15 percentage points on the 1st of April, just as we're going into the Easter weekend, just as we're hopefully coming into a recovery period. Ending that VAT cut for tourism and hospitality on the 1st of April would just be nonsense. It should be extended. It was put in place and announced in July when they thought that we would be well on the way to recovery. If you want a fiscal stimulus to get customers back out, you want to give a boost to the UK tourism industry, then you keep prices low. You don't make us put our prices up by 15 percentage points just at one of our busiest trading periods when tourist businesses will be restarting. So we don't want to have it put back up.
Okay, right. I'm all out of beer and we're nearly up to our last couple of minutes. So perhaps I could just go around the virtual table and hear some final pearls of wisdom. Try and keep it optimistic if possible. Give us reason to be hopeful that these boozers are going to be back on the 2nd of December and they're not going to close again. Dan, let's start with you.
Yeah, my plea is simple to everyone listening, and apologies to Dehenna for this, but fill your MP's post bag. Yeah, we know that we need these businesses. We know they're in mortal peril. And we know there are straightforward solutions that don't endanger public health. So write to your MP and say, get rid of that curfew in whatever tier system for all tiers. Write to your MP and demand they reopen the outdoor spaces because they are low risk, whether in a bar or a restaurant, and tell them to set out any of the things they think are needed to do beyond the COVID security that already applies, because it has to be better rather than spending conservatively £5 billion on furlough alone between now and March. Whilst businesses fail, it has to be better to instead spend a fraction of that making venues as secure as possible, getting customers back into them, where we can see them, where they're contact traced, where they're in a regulated space, rather than them socializing out of sight at home, where almost all the transmission in the community is currently happening. So that's my plea. Call to arms, write to all your MPs, except Dehenna, who sounds like she's on the right side already.
Speaking of Dehenna, over to you.
Well, I think the key thing as we look ahead is making sure that there is absolutely no cliff edge for the hospitality sector. That means going back to what Kate was saying, making sure that we're very mindful of the fact that when that VAT increase is due to come back in, we can't do that. We cannot put a cliff edge on like that, hitting the hospitality sector in such a way. And I'm already making that case to my friends at Treasury, believe me, and I will continue to do so. But my colleague's going to hate me for saying this, but Dan is exactly right. Write to your MPs. Raise these issues, particularly out there if there are, if there are pub landlords, restaurant owners, and you've got real stories to tell. Because I know when I'm reading my emails, there is nothing that kind of draws my attention more than when someone's telling me their story, their real story. A campaign lobby email is a campaign lobby email, but when I'm hearing someone's heart and soul that they've poured into a business they've built up over decades, that's when I really pay attention. So do that, write to your MP. But I suppose my bit of optimism is that this is going to be over. At some point, we're going to look back and go, do you remember that COVID thing? And I'm confident that the hospitality sector can recover. And I'm certainly going to be pushing the Chancellor and Treasury colleagues to make sure that it's in the fittest possible state to do so.
Thanks. Tim, some final words.
I think that we had a good system when we reopened in July after the first lockdown, agreed after consultation with the police, licensing authorities, Kate and UK hospitality, and it worked pretty well, very similar to Sweden and sensible. Since we've been moved on to emergency powers, things have been very, very difficult. So the optimistic thing to do is go back to what works, social distancing and hygiene rules implicit in the July the 4th reopening rules, and try and not revert to the type of emergency powers and confusion that we've had since then. Back to the future.
Thanks. And Kate.
Just a couple of final thoughts from me to build on what others have said. Yes, write to your local MP. The best way to help these businesses, they don't want state handouts, they don't want more money spending on them. They need to get open. If you let us open, then we will get through this. We are innovative, we are dynamic, and we're entrepreneurial. So let us do what we do best. And if you want to have a safe social Christmas, let us reopen, because you can be safer in one of our premises than actually going around and having 3 or 4 families in a small semi or a small terraced house and traveling up and down the country. Let us reopen and we'll be part of the solution. And if you do, and if you get us through this and support us, we will do what we do best, and we'll do what we did after the last financial crash, where year on year, after 2009, we dug the UK economy out of a hole. We regenerated the high street. We invested 4% of all UK capex came from hospitality. We generated 1 in 6 of net new jobs, some years 1 in 3. And we grew every year for the past decade at about 5 to 10% each year. You need us to get the debt down, to get the taxes repaid. And if you support us now, and my final plea to everybody who's listening, if we do manage to get these premises open, if you do care about your pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels, go out and use them, book a Christmas session, go and have lunch, go and have dinner, go and give them some support and give them some love over this Christmas period. And they will give you a big hospitality hug back when we're allowed to end social distancing.
There you go. Drink for victory. Drink back better. Thank you all very much indeed. Been very interesting. I hope and pray that the government listens to some of the stuff that's been said. Really want to go to the pub again and to the